this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. From the middle of the 19th century, the railways had an integral role in warfare. They brought food, ammunition and essential supplies. They also transported troops into the combat zone, and then trains would be used to bring men home. Hospital trains were not a new concept in World War II, but their development moved the carriages away from being ambulances for evacuating the wounded to mobile hospital units with operating theatres. Joining me today is Alexandra Kitty. Alexandra is the author of A Different Track, Hospital Trains of the Second World War. Thanks for joining me. Now, I know hospital trains existed during the First World War, but I wondered when they first came into use, because trains have been about since the first part of the 19th century. How far back can we trace the use of hospital trains?
Well, it started actually as an afterthought during the Crimean War. And they were sending munitions and all this stuff. And they go, oh, let's put some wounded people on this train and let's go. That's how it's actually started. Sort of like, as I said, an afterthought. Nobody really thought this. And then somebody went, had an idea in their head. Wait a minute, we could use a whole train and make, have it as a mobile hospital unit. Once that started getting going, then the First World War was the first, I would say, breakthrough of hospital trains. They weren't as sophisticated as the ones. Once Second World War came, it was a well-oiled machine because they had previous wars where they were using it from an afterthought to actually building the train for the specific purpose of having it as a hospital train. So that's, the Great War was repurposing, but by the Second World War, we were having trains that were built for the specific purpose of being a hospital train.
I wonder if there's a learning curve. If you look at I was trying to start to think of the wars of the 19th century and the First World War. I mean, it's a fascinating idea that someone noticed that you've got trains bringing munitions in that are returning empty. They sort of think, oh, we can utilise that. Is there a learning curve when you look at all the small conflicts that might not actually be small? The Franco-Prussian War, that's a famous railway war. How about the American Civil War? Are they utilising the American Civil War? There's all kinds of wars in that late period. Are they moving towards the hospital train, or are they merely ambulances?
It was a learning curve. Each war, progressively, you saw a little bit of an improvement in the hospital train. Even in the Second World War, how they started building it in the beginning of the war and how they ended up was a progression because it was feedback from the front lines. Okay, they're bombing the hospital trains. What are we going to do? Before that, during the First World War, well, we have to do something because you can't do operations if the car is, not stable. So, we have to make sure there's the stabilization. We have to make sure that we have bunk beds enough for people, that we have a place where we can feed 500 people at once at any given meal. So you had to bring supplies. You had to bring personnel. You had to have an operating theater. You had to have different wards. Each car had to represent a different ward. So when you're looking at the previous wars and this Second World War, this was actually a perfect learning curve. Probably if you go back and look at the hospital trains since their beginning of being an afterthought to the Second World War, you wouldn't recognize them, how different and how sophisticated they became. Because the Second World War, its basic overarching theme was from brute force or primal kind of literacy winning the war to analytical or technological skills winning the war. So this is where you actually see this shift from brute force to cunning being the most important part, being, book smart. The book smart people won, and they showed this with the hospital trains being as well constructed as they were. Newspaper articles used to brag about what was the technological advance of these hospital trains. So this was actually front and center. You wouldn't know it these days that hospital trains would make the front page saying, look what they're doing now. They have an operating table. They have this in there. We have places where people can, ashtrays built in right here so people can smoke on the train. I mean, from the big things to the little things. That was the sense of pride and joy. The towns would go, hey, this young soldier or this young nurse, she's going to be working on a hospital train. We're so proud of so-and-so. And the technological advances were such that being on one of these was considered an honor.
So at the start of the war, is it something that militaries had in their armories ready to, roll? It's rolling stock, isn't it? Ready to go. Are they sort of mothballed from the First War? Or do they even have, in the interwar years, as they're thinking of tanks and planes and everything, do they consider hospital trains at all? Or are they kind of, we've started war and then panic?
No, it was in the plan. The United States was definitely at the front of center of this, UK as well. Because in the First World War, you had some countries do some things well, but other things they didn't do well. So different allied countries kind of started getting together saying, okay, we're going to use the engines from the UK because they're superior to the ones we have here in France. United States was building trains and exporting them overseas. So this was considered an extremely important part of the war effort, was how do we construct the hospital trains? Where are the tracks? What are the possible problems? The one country who dismissed this outright was Germany. They didn't see, their doctor said, we really need this. And the government goes, no, we don't need it. So that tells you something. The countries that took hospital trains into consideration, they won. So this is something that the governments who planned the hospital trains ended up victorious. That flies under the radar. But when you think about it, Germany, who dismissed them against their doctors' wishes, and the countries that said, listen to their doctors and said, yeah, we should have hospital trains. The government listened, the military listened, and that's how we came to having allies having hospital trains, and that they were so ahead of their time. Now we think, well, that's old fashioned. Then that was cutting edge. That was where, we think about planes and tanks, and weapons being, the advances there. We forget that the hospital trains were also part of that cluster of technological wonders that gave an edge.
I mean, the Germans must have presumably then just used literally trains for evacuating the wounded. When we're talking or thinking about the hospital trains, how do they operate? Are they more like, are they operating like a mobile hospital that arrives, parks, men get on, and it's stationary? So it's basically a hospital that arrives and is stationary. Or is it a hospital on the move that's multi-purpose, evacuating? What role is it serving?
You could operate while it was moving. So they would make stops, pick up all the wounded, whether it be soldiers or, say, pregnant women going through labor or civilians who were wounded. And they wouldn't care what side of the war. They would just pick up people, stop for a little while, pick up supplies as well. So they wouldn't just pick up people. They would pick up food, they would pick up medical supplies at their stops, and then they would continue. So it was on the go, whether it was stationary or on the move. It was made to be on the move, but in reality, sometimes you would have people have blockades and they would have to bribe to get their way to the next stop. So it had to be a functional, whether it was stationary or mobile. So a lot of times they were called ambulance trains, but what they were hospital trains, because they would perform amputations, they would perform surgery, they would perform all sorts of stuff until they could get to a mobile hospital or a hospital ship. So those were the ones during war. But you had hospital trains in North America where there wasn't war, but they would be transporting people to their different, cities where they lived, and they would be actually transported on a hospital train as well. So you had two different kind of trains, the trains in the battles and the trains that were bringing people home where there wasn't a war, but they still used hospital trains in North America.
And how did they function? Because I couldn't work out if they ran them almost like trains, and yet they run on lines. They run from A to B. Are these running on fixed timetable sort of lines, or are they kind of routed all over the place? Which then is there's a whole question of how on earth do you route trains randomly around all these large swathes of land that are in the middle of combat?
Well, they would have their definite routes, but you have to remember a lot of these trains were bombed. A lot of railroads were bombed. So then they would have to either rebuild the tracks or they would have to reroute the train. So they would try to do it on a schedule, but war is not very convenient for that. You would do it, but they just bomb the tracks. Where do you go? So there was so much coordination where they had to move things, detours, but they would try to keep it as stable as they could during it. But as I said, war kind of is very inconvenient and very inconsiderate. This is why there was a lot of improvement during the trains, because once they put it into practice, they got feedback and say, okay, how do we improve the train so we can overcome these obstacles that we didn't foresee? Because each war is different. There's different obstacles. There's the geography, the weather, the seasons. All of this was taken into consideration, gone back, and then they would rejig these trains. So in World War II, these trains were rejigged much more than they were in the First World War, because there was such a focus on technology rather than on the First World War. There was a little more emphasis on brute strength and the traditional kind of way we think of fighting a war. This was done a little differently. The hospital trains were almost an experiment in this, because it was so much back and forth in how to improve these trains under all these conditions. So, as the Allies broke through, it would be much more stable. There'd be a stable, there'd be areas where there'd be a stable schedule. During the dark days of the war, it wasn't so much. But once they managed to pull through, it would be very predictable lines, predictable schedule.
Because this is the thing that I can't get my head around, the logistical complexities of it. Because if you think about the First World War, the front lines were relatively static. There's whole areas of France that don't get taken over. So, your train comes along, you've got your coal stops, you've got your water. It's fairly straightforward. But then you say Northwest Europe, the Germans occupy it, and then a month later they don't occupy it. You've then somehow got to factor in, all right, if you're moving everything by truck, that's one thing. But the trains, there's a whole logistical, you've got to think about, well, that hospital trail needs coal and water, probably not, but then it needs all the ancillary material for a working hospital. And it's not that it comes, surely the stuff can't come to you, like if it was a fixed place. Its supplies have to move. So everything is constantly in flux.
And improvisation, my grandmother was a nurse on a hospital train. This was my inspiration. And she would tell me, a lot of times, if there was a farmer field, they would ask the farmer, can we have some crops? So the farmer would say yes. So sometimes you would get it that way. You would have rations, of course, but sometimes you couldn't get it. They sometimes had to perform amputations without anesthesia because they couldn't get anesthesia. So there was a lot of improvisation in terms of supplies. They would parachute supplies. They would take the parachute material and make clothes from it. Hospital trains taught people how to think quickly on their feet. So it was because the mobile units, you had ships and you had the bricks and mortar hospitals. They were less stable because they had their lines. Hospital trains, it was a roulette wheel. So wherever they landed, they had to figure out, how do we navigate through this area? Is there a farmer we can negotiate with? Are they dropping supplies? Can we pick that up? So there was a whole bunch of ways. It was never the same way twice. Each day, it could be even the same route, but each day was totally, up for grabs. There was no predictability. The only predictability was the fact that the trains would come. So, but what was in the trains, who was in the trains, it was a crapshoot. And this is why, people on the hospital trains tended to be superb doctors, superb nurses, because they had to constantly think on their feet. So they had to leverage everything they had around them. Can we get water here? Can we get food here? Doctors learned to bribe people to get things because their first consideration was the patients. So the doctors and nurses became sort of ambassadors, goodwill ambassadors. Doctors had to be very shrewd in who they dealt with, how they get through, because their mandate was to save people's lives through healing. Everything guided them from there. And they only had each other on this train, because to keep moving back and forth, all they had was each other. So they constantly had to think as a group, how do we make sure these people survive? And they did, considering how many people were saved on hospital trains, they triumphed on that because they were simply willing to work around whatever confines they were given at whatever time of day or whatever location. And they could never be predictable. They could never get comfortable because something would always come up. And it wasn't always war. It was sometimes people would commandeer a place. Well, you have to pay us if you want to go through.
I was going to ask about doctors. You mentioned doctors. Well, I thought it was interesting because, as you say, they're stopping. They're kind of everything's in flux constantly. Who's in charge of the train? Is there I'm not sure what I equate this to. Is there a captain is there a train captain or a pilot? Who's in charge?
Well, you had people running the trains, but then you had the doctors who had to make the decisions because the mandate of the trains was basically to save lives. So this is where doctors were put more in charge than anybody else on these trains because they had to calculate supplies. If there was illness, sometimes if there was an outbreak of something, there would be higher casualties. What do we do if there's an infection? What if we do if there's an illness? So doctors were basically the coordinators of these trains. What would be done? How do we keep this as disinfected as possible? Where do we get supplies? So the doctors were pretty much the ones in charge of these trains, maybe not of the routes, but how they were going to be operating within these hospitals. The final say was basically the doctors because they had to make decisions that nobody else could understand because they weren't the ones with the medical degree. And the logistics were done by, the ones who were running the trains, but the doctors were the ones basically that was their say so.
So you have up to 300 patients on these trains. So how many staff do you have on looking after up to 300 patients? Because that's a lot of patients to have to keep an eye on.
There would be quite a few nurses. I think there would be sometimes depending on how many cars. So there could be as small as 10 cars. There could be as big as 35 cars. So each one would have about maybe 2 or 3 nurses per car. And then they would have to have their assistants. Then you had to have so many doctors per car. And that kind of thing. You had to have the staff, the cleaning staff, all that had to be in there. So a significant number of the people in the trains were the staff. But within that, they could have about, depending on the size of the car, up to 300 patients, sometimes more because there'd be a lot of wounded and they knew there wouldn't be another train coming for a while. So they would have to, and they would be walking wounded, what they would say. People who they didn't need a bed, they could sit. So they would have people who maybe lost an arm, but they could sit. They were pretty much okay in one piece, but they wouldn't have a bed. So if we can fit a few more people, we could fit a few more people. So it was also depending on how many supplies they had. So it was constant calculations of how many people can we take. Because a lot of times some of these had even maternity wards because they would be pregnant women. They couldn't get to a hospital. And I've met people who were born on hospital trains during the Second World War. And the weirdest of places, it was all dependent on the area, the region, the type of wounds that they were seeing, how bad the casualties were. So everything was, as I said, calculations. There was no fixed set memorizing rules that we might see in a regular hospital during peacetime. This was how many people can we save? How many people can we save? It was constantly calculating positive scheming of how many people can we save in this one region, to stop them, prevent death. So that was the number one thing. How do we prevent that? How many people can we save? How many people can we get out of there? So it was a constant flux. So there was trying to bring order in chaos, but chaos still was, making problems for wanting to do things with order.
I did wonder, it's a wonderful thing, making order out of chaos. I did wonder when you got on the train if it was suddenly tranquility from the chaos outside, in a war-torn world, if the train gave order.
It did in many ways. So one way was the nurses, because they were looking after patients. They weren't just nurses. They were psychologists. They were ambassadors. So they calmed down a lot of people who lost their families, who lost limbs, who lost their homes, their livelihoods, who were having, mental breakdowns. So they had nurses who looked after them and really, really cared. And I know my grandmother and my mother, who wasn't born at the time, but my mother remembered very well soldiers and different people coming all the way to my grandmother's house to thank her. So there was the emotional order. They got mostly food. Sometimes it was rations. Sometimes it was whatever they could get from a farmer's field. So there was food that way. There was some unnerving things. It was sometimes you had the stench because they were operating. People died. There was all that. So there was things that were unnerving. It was less unnerving than being in the battlefield or being, in a wide open space that in comparison, it was a lot of tranquility in these places. They would play cards with each other. People would talk to each other. They would try to get over things, and they would talk about their families and their lives and what they were hoping for. So they could socialize. So it wasn't you weren't turned feral. You were dealing with nurses, doctors, other patients, other staff, where you started to socialize again. So not all was lost. So the order was probably what I would call a psychological or emotional order on these trains.
Yeah, I wonder if just the nature of the train itself being not destroyed and is sort of a modern. Well, I would say I think it's the cover of the book. There's a wonderful painting of the cover of the book, who I can't recall who it's by, but I wonder if you want to describe what we're an audio medium, so it's quite hard for people. When people picture hospital trains, I'm not sure they'll quite be able to picture how it works, because they're not just carriages. Is each carriage a self-contained hospital almost within itself? I've not misunderstood that.
No, they had beds. So they had, they had tiers of beds, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, depending on how high it was. So they would have beds. Some of the cars had beds. So they would be like a little hospital ward. And there'd be 1 or 2 that had a dining area. And then they would have ones where there was an office for the doctors. And then they had one that was an operating table. So each car had something different. In each car where there were beds was a different ward. So this could be a ward for maternity ward. This could be people who are walking wounded. This is ones for severely injured. These are ones who have illness. So they had different wards depending on what was wrong with you within the train, just like a regular hospital. But it was just, instead of being stacked on floors, it was just cars on a train. So you had places where there would be meetings. You had places where the doctors would be performing surgery, and each one had its own purpose. So it was, you take a hospital, you take a train, you literally fuse them together, and that's what you get, making the train as much of a hospital as they could. And they did a pretty good job. All things considered, they actually did a very good, reasonable facsimile of a hospital inside a train.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking hospital trains with Alexandra Kitty. One of the points I think you make in the book is that unlike a hospital which might have multiple corridors and multiple ways of access, a train doesn't. It's one corridor, at which point the food carriage doesn't really work because everyone's got too many people all at once moving around. So they have to make smaller food areas.
Yeah, they did have dining areas in these cars so people could, the ones that were really wounded, they would bring the tray to their bed. But if you were walking wounded or if you were staff, you ate in the dining area like everybody else because they had to have as an order in here. So if you couldn't get up, they would feed you from a tray at your bed. If you were good enough, then you hustled yourself to the dining area, and that's where you ate. So, and you weren't there for long. Depending on how close you were to a hospital or a hospital ship, you might be there a few hours, you might be there a couple of days, depending on stuff, because the primary use of the hospital trains was the temporary hospital before we get you to the real hospital. But they still had to, operate on people. That took sometimes hours. Well, you had to finish the operation on the train. So it had to be fully functional. Sometimes they knew might be miss a stop. They couldn't go. They might have to go be rerouted. So you never knew if the hospital you aimed for would be the one you'd get to. And if you did, would you get it on the scheduled time? It's a roulette wheel. It was a constant roulette wheel, and they had to constantly guess, and things would happen. Okay, we reroute. Okay, we have to go to the hospital ship, or we have to go here instead. But they never abandoned anybody. They didn't just say, okay, we're not going, okay, goodbye. They stuck to the person to the very end, which, was not easy given their circumstances and the stress they must have gone through their minds. But the first thing was what got off was to think about other people. And that's why these trains were so successful, because they were thinking about the wounded.
And presumably when the military planners are planning large operations, the largest I can think of is D-Day. Presumably when they're putting all the plans in place for bringing tanks ashore, I assume they're planning on moving hospital trains to France. So they're not thinking, well, we'll just take some French trains and quickly rebuild them. They're shipping trains to. Is that all part of the planning for these large operations? Because you never hear them being factored in.
No, it was central. So they would build the trains, and the World War II, they were more or less built from the United States, and they shipped them over to Europe. So this is a lot of UK built their own trains, but a lot of these trains were shipped from the US. And so that was always part of the plan. When they were planning, there was always hospital trains. It's hard to imagine that now because we don't talk about hospital trains. We don't realize they were central. That was, part of particularly in the US government, that was their plan. But we don't think about, you think it was almost an afterthought in the Second World War. You wouldn't think that was their central consideration was the hospital trains because that was their biggest problem, saving lives of people who were damaged by bombs, gunfire, what have you. You had your tanks, you had your armory, you had everything else, but in that equation was always hospital trains. And that was the government would plan. And then the private sector would build these trains to specification, and then they would ship them off. Some of them would be damaged. Some of them, would be destroyed. They would bring new ones. It was a constant flow. It was a central part of the military planning, particularly in the U.S., but after the war,
I guess plane travel overtook it. I was going to say, but when you think about the staffing of these trains, who's running the trains? Is it the army? Is it? They have a separate organisation? Are they staff when they're recruited? Is there a specific train company that run these trains?
Well, it depended on the country. So, I'm going to give you an instance in Canada, where I'm from. They were asking young women, we need volunteer nurses on these trains. We'll train you. My grandmother was from Europe, but she was trained. They were recruiting people. So the government said to young women, well, if you'd like to volunteer on a hospital train, they had so many young women that they had to they had to stop because they had more women willing to go on these trains to work as nurses than they had spots for these. So the government would be the ones in charge of recruiting the staff, the doctors, the nurses. And they had no shortage of women who wanted to work as nurses on these trains, for instance. So in Canada, the government put out a call. They had so many people that they had to say, stop, we have more than enough. That's how they did it. So each country kind of did it their own way. Some through the military, some through straightly from the government, some through medical organizations. A lot of volunteers came. My grandmother actually was recruited from a family member who said, well, we're looking for nurses. She was a young teenage girl. Would you like to do it? And she said, yes. Actually, that's what saved her life, because when she came back, her whole family were killed by fascists in concentration camps. She was the lone survivor, strictly because she went to work as a nurse. So they were looking for young people. They might not be the ones to work as soldiers, but they would be the ones working on the trains. So it was similar to a recruitment drive for soldiers, except they were there for the trains.
In Canada, was your grandmother, was she in the army, or is there a separate organisation?
No, my grandmother was in Europe. She wasn't Canadian, but she became Canadian much later. But she was was a relative who worked for the government, saying, well, we're looking for young women to work as nurses. And she said, sign me up. She thought this was interesting. And so she said yes. So that's how she got on there. The governments would put the call in for nurses, and then they would give training, and so many young teenagers. My grandmother was a teenager, so they had girls in their late teens, 17, 18, 19, who were nurses on these trains. So this is how they got the nursing staff, that doctors who were already trained, either through the military or through volunteering, they would staff the rest of the trains because they wanted to make sure they had as much medical personnel as they could get working there. So they never had a problem finding people wanting to work on the trains. Many things were working against them in many ways, from supplies to safety. Getting volunteers to work on these trains, that was probably the easiest part of it, particularly for nurses, because so many young women in North America went, a lot of women in Europe went. My grandmother was one of these women who went on these trains. Women, I say women, she was a girl. And she was like, sign me up. I'm really happy. And she said that was the happiest time of her life because she felt a sense of belonging. She felt a sense of purpose, and she was not the only one. So a lot of people, they might not have had a gun in their hand, but they were soldiers in a different way.
I do wonder, actually, nursing, it tends to be, you instantly think of it being a gendered occupation. I do wonder how it broke down. It got me suddenly thinking it's not a direct combat role. So do you find that the nurses might have male nurses and female doctors, or do you? And I guess it depends on who's running the train. And it'd be interesting to know that staff breakdown because it's such a different environment that they're working in because you're neither at the front or at the back.
Although rare, there were female doctors. Although rare, there were a few female doctors. I can't speak about male nurses. I'm sure there were. And one thing I should mention, these trains did not have everybody from the same country. So my grandmother, she worked, there were women from Czech Republic, Poland, the former Yugoslavia, UK, Canada, US. So this was a way to meet people from all over the world. Was working on these trains because you didn't just have, some trains did have, let's say, all American personnel, but more likely than not, the trains had a mix of different allies and they were working on the trains. Not just the staff, but the patients came from different places. You learn to speak. And, my grandmother learned a whole bunch of different languages because she had to communicate with you didn't know who you were bringing into the train, what language they spoke. So this was one of those things where it was almost like a United Nations in a hospital train because the patients and the staff came from all over the place.
I think that's fascinating, the idea of having literally, you could have the German, a Canadian and a British all on the same train. All right, they might be separated somehow, but it's a fascinating idea. It's a hospital. This is a neutral zone. Were they run under the auspices of the Red Cross, or did they just carry the Red Cross?
Well, no, the Red Cross was involved, and they had the Red Cross symbols on the trains in the hope that they wouldn't bomb the trains. So let them know that they were neutral. That didn't work so well. There were a lot of trains that were bombed. There were a lot of trains that were shot at, which was a shame because the trains didn't care who they picked up. Were you wounded? I mean, they did pick up German soldiers that were then prisoners, but they kept them in a separate car, but they were tended to like everybody else. So it didn't matter. They picked up the wounded. If you were, from the enemy side, we are still going to look after you. You are a prisoner of war, but we're still looking after you. So this was one of those things where people learned tolerance and they had to pick up people and you just didn't care because you had these mangled bodies and stuff. Everybody looked alike. They looked like a hot mess. You had to, piece them back together and preserve their humanity. So it wasn't just, well, we preserve the physical body. We want to make sure these people are as healed as they can be emotionally too. So that was part of the nurses' jobs to make sure that, people kind of kept calm, that they didn't have outbreaks in the trains. What was expected of these young women was absolutely extraordinary. And what the thing is they managed to do all these things at once and save people. And a lot of them never, they didn't, that wasn't what they were probably in the beginning of the war. It was the last thing they thought they were going to do.
Yeah, it's probably a lot more involved, by the end of the war than they ever anticipated at the start of the war, as you say. Yeah, it's that shift from being an ambulance to something more than an ambulance in a war-torn world. I wonder how long they operated after the war, because clearly Europe is devastated by war. Do we have any idea how long they continued to exist before they sort of fell out of service?
They fell out of service fairly quickly after the Second World War. They might have a couple of years later, but those were also just bringing people home. Like in Europe, just the hospital train bringing the wounded home. So they were in operation for about a couple of years after the war. They popped up during the Korean War, and they're actually right now in Ukraine. So they're actually still in that area. They're still using hospital trains. So wherever there's war, usually we're going to see a hospital train. They still manufacture. It's just not the same intensity, not the same innovations. They just, wherever there is, where there's wounded that have to be transported, quietly there will be a hospital train. So they're still in there very faintly, but they still exist.
That's fascinating, is it? I wonder if is there any, do we know if there's any World War II examples exist anywhere? Has anyone saved any?
That's a good question, because most of those trains were bought right after the war. They had exhibitions. And then you had people like the Ringling Brothers Circus buy them. So you had people buy these and they kind of disappeared. It's very hard to know if it's an actual train because they were kind of dismembered and sent here, sent there. Some of them had some exhibitions. It's almost like they vanished off the face of the earth. There is some, but it's so hard to find. You know, when you're talking about war, people want to see the weapons. They don't necessarily want to see the hospital train, because mostly women were on these, manning them as nurses. And when the nurses came home, they just went back home. They didn't have their ticker tape parade. And that's part of the reason why we don't see hospital trains in any prominence, because people thought that's what they had to do. And when it was over, we just go back. On the hospital trains, I think a lot of the nurses just wanted to kind of move on, because they saw what they saw. You know, they saw kids in pieces. They saw young people in pieces. They saw families torn apart, and they just kind of go, you know, I seen these people torn apart. I just want to start a family and see something whole, instead of seeing people in pieces.
Well, that would seem like a good place to finish. Thank you. Loyal listener, if you are interested to know more about the history of hospital trains and their use during World War II, Alexandra's book is A Different Track, Hospital Trains of the Second World War. Next time, I'm hoping we'll be looking at Italy. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice